name is Jin, and then this is a senior project. What senior project is basically from what we studied all 4 years in Eternity Bible College. We put all that studies together and choose a particular cultural group and research and show how we can, or what ways can we do to spread the gospel to this particular group well and effectively. And the cultural group for the senior project is the Korean Americans, specifically the second generation Korean Americans. The second generation is usually defined as the children of immigrants who are either born in the United States or raised and educated in the United States. The purpose in choosing this group was because not only am I part of this group because I am a Korean American second generation, but these are the people that I minister to. These are the people that I spend time with. These are the people that I simply do life together. As I was researching and trying to figure out which particular group I need to pick for the senior project, I was looking back my life, 26 years, and there wasn't a time where I was not with a Korean American. And I don't think I will ever be away from the Korean American culture or Korean culture itself. And that's why this was the perfect opportunity to do the research and do the senior project on this particular group, Korean American second generation. I have this throughout the research, throughout studying, I have learned and discovered about Korean history. My parents' history, the first generation's history, our stories as well, the second generation, the brokenness from both of them, and so much more. And we're going to learn that, and we're going to talk about that throughout the presentation. The second generations, we are often confused about where we belong because we feel as we're not welcome from both sides. Because we are either too American for the Korean community or we are too Korean for the American community. We Korean Americans, the second generation, we are looking for a community. We're looking for a home where we can be ourselves and a place where we can come as we are and we can live as we are and act as we are. Also, this gospel that we have, this good news that we have is really the global gospel that surpasses the national and racial boundaries. It will break down the walls between the social, the cultural, the racial, the language barriers, all that. That's the gospel that we have. And I thought it was the perfect cultural group. The Korean American would be the perfect cultural group for me to do the senior project on. To learn about the second generation Korean Americans, we first need to dive into the history, the story of our first generation, story of our parents. We need to do that because we learned in Eternity Bible College, our first year of our Eternity Bible College, that context is king. The background, the setting, the context, we need to learn that to really spread the gospel effectively to a particular group. And what is not a better way to dive into the 3 periods of the Korean immigrations to America. The first wave of Korean immigration to America began from 1903 to 1949. In December 1902, 56 men and 21 women and 25 children traveled from Korea across the Pacific Ocean and landed in Honolulu, Hawaii on January 13, 1903. 2 missionaries made this possible. The names of the missionaries were Horace Allen and George Herbert. As they brought the gospel to Koreans in Korea, and through their effort, about 40% of Korean immigrants were converted to Christianity. And they chose to come to Hawaii for religious freedom as well as for a better life. The church they planted in Hawaii, these 40% of Korean immigrants, the church they planted in Hawaii functioned as a cultural and religious asylum where the immigrants isolated due to their language and cultural barriers found. And the church was where they found comfort. The second wave of Korean immigrations to America began from 1950 to 1964. The second wave of Korean immigration began in 1950, which was after the Japanese occupation in 1910 to 1945, where Korea was annexed by Japan. And because we're talking about the Korea being colonized by Japan, I want to kind of stop here with the second wave of Korean immigration and talk about these two factors that is deeply rooted in Koreans and Korean Americans. One is called Han and one is called Confucianism. And I want to talk about that because Han was especially developed, and it got added to the Han, especially during the time of Japanese colonization of Korea. So let us stop real quick, and then let us talk about the Japanese colonization. And during this time when Japanese colonized Korea, Koreans lost their national identity and were forced to adopt Japanese culture, including language and even changing their names to Japanese. So not only were they losing their nationality or national identity, but they were losing their identity of themselves as well. Also, the Christians often face losing their jobs in the schools or government, or even expulsion from school, and even closing to the point of closing the institution for not accepting and attending the religious ceremony of Japan, which is known as Shinto. And from this injustice, from this unfairness, from this losing our identity, losing our nationality, this idea of Han gets developed. This concept of Han is very difficult to understand and difficult to grasp, not only for non-Koreans, but even for Koreans as well, to fully grasp. Theologian Seonam Dong, or Dong Seonam, describes Han as a feeling of unresolved resentment against injustice, suffered a sense of helplessness because of the overwhelming odds against one. A feeling of an acute pain in one's guts and bowels, making the whole body writhe and squirm, and an obstinate urge to take revenge and to right the wrong. And he says Han is all these emotions combined. And then from Japanese's colonizations to Korea, all these injustice, all these suffering of sense of helplessness is getting added to it. This Han, this emotion is put into our hearts, and it's never really out. It never really gets out, and we can't really be satisfied from it. We just keep it deeply into our hearts. And let me share a story, or let me share what a mother who immigrated to the United States described Han as. She described Han as an oppression, a struggle, and difficulties that she went through as an immigrant. The language barrier, the cultural differences, the negative emotions, which trigger by the unfairness and mistreatment. And the Han gets developed because of this mistreatment, and she couldn't complain or even say the word no when she was getting mistreated, because if she said no or complained, then she would lose her way of income. She would lose her job, which means that she doesn't have an option, or she can't place a food on the table for her children and the roof over their heads. And like I said, this concept of Han, this emotion gets passed down from generation to generation to generation, because we could even call this mother's Han as the children's Han. The children's Han could be what the mother went through, this injustice, this mistreatment, and that she couldn't say no or complain. The children could consider that event as their own Han as well. This idea of Han gets passed on through generation and generation, and we can never really try to take it out of our hearts or out deeply. It's just rooted in there. The second factor about Korean Americans, the worldview that we have, and that how a factor that develops our worldview of Korean American or Koreans, is Confucianism. And the essence of Confucianism is the reverence for established authority and order. To Koreans, that means that the son should honor the father. that a younger person should honor and respect the older person. All social interactions were decided by the hierarchy system that was from the teachings of Confucianism. This reminds me of a story of when I was young, when I was in elementary school, when I just recently moved to the States. And it was when an English teacher was talking to me about scolding me or something about what I did. And as she was talking to me, I was looking down on the floor and I wasn't really saying much. I wasn't really giving her a response. And the reason behind that is because she was an older person, and I learned as I grew up in Korea, the culture from Korea, the worldview from Korea, the way I saw the world was, I am not supposed to look at an older person eye to eye when they're especially scolding me or when they're talking to me. Because that meant that if we were to look at eye to eye, that means that we're on the same level. But in Korean culture, if the older you are, you're higher than the younger person. That's why one of the first factor, or one of the first thing that comes up when you meet someone is of their age, so that they can determine the relationship. In Korean culture, we have titles. We have titles from an older guy, older girl. We would call them hyung, nuna, or even in school. And upperclassmen, we would call them 선배, and lowerclassmen are 후배. And then 후배s are supposed to respect and listen to the 선배. And this goes on and on and on from to different workplaces, schools, friends, and so on, and all social things. This idea of Confucianism and this idea of Han is truly deeply rooted in our Korean culture. And this is how this shapes us, and this shapes the worldview of a Korean American. So now we dive back into our second wave of Korean immigrations to the States. In 1948, Korea was split into two political entities. A rightist government in South Korea supported by the United States, and the communist government in the North was supported by the Soviet Union. And during this time, during the second wave of Korean immigrations to America, there were about 100,000 so-called internationally married women, or also known as military brides, who entered the United States between 1950 and 1989. While approximately about 300,000 Korean adoptees entered the United States beginning in 1953. The war brides suffer from the alienation and cultural barriers like the immigrants from the first wave in 1903 to 1949 because of the cultural barrier, because of the language barrier, the new setting, new land, and new culture. But these war brides had it worse, because they were isolated from both Korean and American communities, for they were not allowed to leave because they were in a military campsite. And the second group of immigrants during this wave were the war orphans, also known as the GI babies, who experienced a triple stigma because not only were they a mixed race, but they were a fatherless, and their mothers were treated as prostitutes who had born racially impure babies. These GI babies are a lot like the second generation, or these GI babies are the second generations. And then as we go on, as we talk about our third wave of the Korean immigrations to America, and then we'll continue with our stories. So the third wave of Korean immigrations to America begins from 1965 to where we are now. The third wave of Korean immigration was during 1965 when the Immigration Act was passed, and it made it possible for a lot of Koreans or Korean Americans for reunification and employment. The number of Korean immigrants was slowly increased, and Korean immigrants were the largest group to step their foot into the United States. Unlike the other immigrants who had no choice but to immigrate, these Korean immigrants on the third wave voluntarily moved to America. The only people that didn't have a choice were their children. Their children were the ones who are known as the second generation. also known as Gyopo in Korean or Ide. These children were born in Korea but migrated to United States, but they did not have a choice in doing that. They followed their parents and immigrated to a strange place and had to simply adjust to a different setting, different language, different culture, and different social setting. Which is one of the reasons why many second generation question or even despite their Korean roots, because they didn't have a choice, and there's a lot of difficulties in being in a different setting with different culture, different language, and trying to find friends, trying to find a community, and so on. And not only that, they were pressured by their parents to live the American dream. We constantly had to live in anxiety and pressure and had to learn to balance the two cultures. A story from Da-bin Kim or Kim Da-bin, a Korean American who is a second generation, explains his life as a chameleon, where he would say that wherever he would be at, he would change his attitude to fit into a various social group. He would act differently at school, he would act differently at church, and he would especially act differently at home. He was never able to truly show himself and be himself because and he says that there is a sense of yearning to be at home, wanting to be at home, where he can truly ground himself as himself. This is very similar to our story, and there are many stories like that. There are stories of mine. There are stories that are watching this video. You know who you are. And then there are stories that I've seen through videos that is very similar to like this. When interviewing many second generations, I often heard a similar thing. And that similar thing is that they often desire and their value and their want is a community where they can belong. Because they feel as if they're not welcomed or wanted. They feel like an outsider, they feel like an outcast. But we can't seem to find a home where we can settle and be free of ourselves, for we often feel unwelcome to both Korean or American communities. Min-jin Yang, a second generation, shares a similar story like Da-bin Kim. Her hardship on fully trying to understand her identity in the United States is from her testimony. On the slide, you can probably see the YouTube link that I have. That's her whole testimony. But I'm going to share a quote from her in this video that in a way shares or talks about her confusion of identity and her difficulties trying to find her identity. She says, "Later, I started to have many American friends, but I couldn't feel the sense of belonging. I thought I needed to adapt to a new culture as soon as I could, and so I became like a yes man, always imitating them. My friends would say, 'Let's eat a hamburger,' then I would eat a hamburger. And also they would say, 'Let's watch a movie,' and then I would watch a movie. Or if they say something is fun, then I would think, maybe that is fun. Later, I became like someone who couldn't express her own feelings or opinions, and I felt I was hiding myself to them. Depending on which social group I was meeting, I always had to change myself to fit in with them." This is a story of Min-jin Yang, and this is a very much like the story of us, Korean American, who are second generation. An important aspect of understanding the second generation is the formation of identity for the English-speaking second generation immigrant. And there is these two consciousness that an author named Du Bois talk about to describe how the feelings and the experience that Min-jin Yang and Da-bin Kim, or even myself and other people that I interviewed, experience. One is the double consciousness, and the second one is called triple consciousness. The double consciousness, the author Du Bois, he says it this way. He says, "This double consciousness This sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of the others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One feels his two-ness, an American and a Korean, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strings. Korean American must deal with the reality of not being totally accepted in white society and having to behave in a certain manner in society at large, while behaving in another manner in their own cultural setting. So now the triple consciousness. Triple consciousness is very similar to double consciousness, but for second generation Korean Americans, we don't feel completely at home in society at large. And we know painfully, and we painfully are aware of being different when confronted by a society dominated by the American society. The Ide, the Gyopo, the second generation, we must still live and adapt to the American society. The second generation Korean American Christians, therefore, we may not feel completely accepted and be at home in an American Christian community. While we may appreciate the Korean food, the culture, there is that enough barrier, such as language and ethnic values, that will hinder a second generation from feeling at home in a Korean-speaking first generation Korean immigrant church. The second generation Korean American, therefore, we're gonna feel totally affirmed and totally accepted within the context of other like-minded second generation Korean Americans, or even second generation Americans. And driven by this new triple consciousness identity, us second generation will often remain in a single ethnic church and begin to form a Korean American or an Asian American subgroup. So now, how do we spread the good news to the Korean American second generations? The good news that we have. Well, we need to first know what the good news is. Good news is when God created the heavens and the earth and endowed humanity with his image. It says in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. And he gave us the capacity to reflect the community that is found in the Trinity. In the unity that is found in diversity, us humans can now reflect the image of God. The cultural mandate reveals that there is a value in the variety of cultures that are created by the creature, us humans, made in the image of God. But the image of God found in the individual and in human cultural expression began to be damaged and perverted in the fall. Genesis 3. And there is corruption of humanity because of sin. And after the fall, the need for self-preservation led to covering up with the fig leaf. The Tower of Babel was even built to cover up human insecurity, and fear eventually ended up with the curse of a world divided along ethnic and cultural lines. Babylon continued the line of fallen humanity. However, the hope and the promise of this shalom unity, this community that God has given to us to reflect his image, is again shown in Micah 4. Through the laying down of power, God promised the restoration of the shalom community as all nations and all people gathered to worship at the mountain of the Lord. This restoration was inaugurated in the incarnation, the life, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the ascension of Jesus Christ, who demonstrated and embodied a story of both suffering and celebration. His physical body was ascended into heaven, so that the body of Christ, the church, can now live out the shalom community. Another phase of the reversing of the curse of the Tower of Babel occurs in Acts chapter 2. Not only, and it talks about not only is a single language restored through the gift of tongues, but all different nations began to gather together to worship and serve the one true God. And as the community expands, as God's community expands, they are confronted with the Jewish captivity of the church. The Jerusalem Council depicts in Acts 15, releases the church from Jewish captivity and launches the church forward to continue pursuing the Shalom community. Then the gospel goes forth into all corners of the world, moving towards the picture of Revelation 7, when every nation, every tribe, every people, and all language will gather to worship before the throne of God. The future image of Revelation 7 reveals the fulfillment of the cultural mandate and the image of God found in the individual, and is mirrored of cultural expression. A new Jerusalem is established when the glory and honor of the nation will be brought into it. Revelations 21:26. We live in this time. We live between Acts 2 and Revelation 21. The hope of the promise has been revealed in Micah 4 and Acts 2. He has given the community the language, the cultural barrier, the social barrier. All those walls are broken down, and we get to worship as truly one body. Whether you're an immigrant, whether you are a citizen, it doesn't matter, because we are a citizen of the kingdom of God. We're a kingdom citizen of God's kingdom. And that's where we worship God together with one voice, with one mind, with one heart. The Shalom community is made possible by the work of Jesus. So that's the good news that we have. But how do we spread the good news effectively to the second generation Korean Americans? For second generation, this gospel that Jesus gives to us, it provides this unconditional love and unconditional approval. That there is no longer a need for us to simply hide, just like Adam and Eve, covering themselves with the fig tree, or Tower of Babel was to cover their fears and insecurity. We did that we did that just like the story of Tabin Kim, just like the story of Min Jin Yang. And we covered ourselves, our insecurity and our embarrassment with the identity that is not ours. The identity that Jesus gave to us, or God gave to us, the image of God. And we always lived as if it was conditional, that we always had to do this, we always had to become someone else to be loved and to be approved and to be accepted. Now and then He loves us unconditionally, and He tells us that there is a community for us, His kingdom community, and we are welcome to join just as we are. And then we can call this community as a home. And this good news, this gospel, it tells us to repent from our idolatry and our lifestyle. We lived as if our identity was not image of God. We were embarrassed of our identity, the identity that God gave us, and we tried to cover it up with a different identity to simply fit in a community and fit into a different set of social groups. Just like a story of my brother, when he was young, he would speak English to our parents. Whether he was embarrassed in front of his friend to speak Koreans, he would speak English to the parents. And then the relationship between the family started to break apart because the parents thought that he was disrespecting because he was speaking English to them and the language that they did not even understand. But then for my brother, he was just embarrassed of speaking in front, speaking Korean to the American friends that he was around. This is a small example, but this is something that the gospel tells us to repent from. That we no longer have to hide ourselves. We can just be of ourselves. We don't have to change our lifestyle. We don't have to change our identity. Jesus tells us to come as you are. And as we come as we are accepted as we are. Where I'm accepted as Jin, the Korean American second generation Jin. So why should we care? I mean, the reason why we must care about the Korean American second generation Korean American is because we are part of us immigrants are in the story of God. In Deuteronomy chapter 10 verse 19 it says, "You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." In Zechariah chapter 7, 9-10, it says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, render true judgment, show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress the widow, the orphans, the alien, or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another." And in Ephesians chapter 2:19, it says, "So then you are no more strangers and sojourners, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God." God cares for these immigrants. Not only for the Korean American second generation Korean Americans, but he cares for the immigrants. He has a heart for the sojourners. And who are we to say who are immigrants? Because you and I, whether you're American, whether you're Korean, whether you're of different ethnicity, if we are a follower of God, we are a stranger of this world because we don't belong to this old earth, but we belong to the new heavens and new earth. That's where we belong to the kingdom citizens, the household of God that is mentioned in Ephesians chapter 2 verse 19. God cares, therefore we must care for these people. And we must listen to what God tells us to act towards these strangers, these sojourners, these immigrants. We must show love, we must invite them, we must move towards them, just like how Jesus moved towards the outsiders. So, what now? What do we do with all these informations? Well, we're to spread the gospel well to these people. Why? Because we have to be a church for the hurting. We have to be a church for the outsiders, we have to be the church for the sinners, and we have to be the church for the outcasts. We need to be a church that reaches out to the streets. We have to move towards them. We have to be a neighborhood church even as our neighborhood is changing. And to spread the gospel well and effectively to a Korean American second generation, there are some ministry strategies that I thought of. I think it's a very universal strategy, but it's very crucial to us second generation Korean Americans. What we must do is to listen to their stories. Throughout all Korean American second generation throughout all our life, we were never listened to. We never was able to speak what is in our hearts and what is in our mind, because as we grew up, younger you are, the less of a chance for you to speak up, or less of a chance for you to speak what is truly in your heart. Second is, we must correct their view of the gospel. Their good news might not be the good news that they're looking for, that the true gospel is telling them. that there is no condition to be loved. There is no condition to be approved. There is no condition to be accepted to the kingdom community. And lastly, the most important thing is we must pursue genuine relationships. The reason behind that is because that's what they desire. They desire, they want, and their need is a community where they can belong. And that can start from pursuing a genuine relationship. You move towards them and pursue the genuine relationship, and you listen to their stories. And as you listen to their story, you slowly begin to correct their view of the gospel by simply doing life with them, grabbing lunch, grabbing coffee, and so on. As you build friendship, as you build genuine relationship, you will have an opportunity and a chance to do that. And one thing that I want to share with you guys who are non-Koreans, and you all Koreans who are watching this know this, but us Koreans, we will always deny the first offer. You will have to ask us the second or the third time. Throughout our culture, we always we are taught that we are supposed to decline the first offer. So don't be discouraged if we say, no, I can't go to a lunch or a coffee or whatever with you. Just always ask a second time or a third time or even more than that. Then they will eventually accept it. It's not that we decline because we don't want to. Maybe that might be the case, but we almost every time we decline out of respect. Now, Korean American, the second generation, we all learn all these informations. And I said in the beginning of our presentation, I said that I chose this particular group of Korean American because not only am I a Korean American, but I minister to these people and I, in a way, hang out with these people and basically do life with them. And our church, Centerville Presbyterian Church, CPC, we're about sharing the good news within our fellowship of believers and the community at large and the world. That is our mission statement, and that is what says it on our website. And our neighborhood is changing. Our neighborhood is changing, or it is already changed from what you guys have experienced. I've pulled out a statistic of our Fremont, the city of Fremont population, and about 58.40% are Asians. In there, it could be Chinese American, Japanese American, Korean Americans, or Indo-Asia, or many other Asians. And then 24.13% are the white. And then the other is the 8.10%. Now, if our population is changing around us in our church, then we must prepare and we must figure out a strategy to prepare to share the gospel in their the way that they will be affected by the gospel. Because let me share with you guys these two stories. The story of the Hurricane Katrina, what happened at a church that went through the hurricane in Katrina, and the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. So the story of Hurricane Katrina. Pastor David Anderson relates a story about an all-white church in Baton Rouge in Louisiana. He says, in years past, the pastor had stated that the church wanted to be more multicultural. But this call seemed out of place for a community that was all white, with no chance of change in the near future. But an unforeseen event would occur in Louisiana. A hurricane swept through their region, a hurricane named Katrina. And before you knew it, 500,000 people evacuated to Baton Rouge from New Orleans. This particular white church had to now live out its Christianity with approximately 100 new black strangers attending every week. And the question he asks the audience is, would your church be ready for this type of change? And another example is from the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Several years ago, a significant number of Korean American students enter the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Many of the Korean American students noted that the school seemed ill-prepared to deal with the huge influx. No preparation had been made to deal with the changing demographic of the seminary. At a gathering of Korean American students, one of the seminary administrator was asked about specific plans to deal with this influx of Korean American students. The administrator admitted that by saying that they didn't know that they were coming. They were off guard. And the school was just carried on with their business as usual. What I want to tell our churches, our CPC, our Centerville Presbyterian Church in Fremont, is the same question as the pastor asked. Is our church ready for these changes? It has already changed. The population has flipped. Our church may see of the same, but outside of our church, there are different populations. And are we going to be a neighborhood church, even though our neighborhood has changed? And are we still going to be about sharing the good news with our fellowship of believers and the community at large outside of us and the world? And to do that, and hopefully this presentation, hopefully learning about Korean American second generation, hopefully that is a first step or like a small step forward to our preparation of spreading the gospel effectively and well to our neighbors.